When I was a boy, the word respect was not something my father explained, it was something he demanded. It lived in the silence of our house, in the way my mother avoided eye contact when he entered a room, in the stiff way my sister and I sat at the dinner table, hands in our laps, waiting for his signal to begin. Our home was clean, disciplined, and quiet, painfully quiet. You could almost hear your heartbeat echo off the wooden walls if you spoke out of turn. We lived in a small town in the late 1980s, a place where families looked perfect from the outside. Our house was no different. Trimmed hedges, freshly painted fence, curtains always drawn just enough to let in the afternoon sun. But inside, everything belonged to my father's rules. Shoes aligned perfectly by the door, books stacked according to height. Even the dinner plates had a strict order: meat, then vegetables, then bread. I used to think the world worked like that too, that maybe outside our front yard people also lived by invisible rules only fathers could see. My father was a man of few words but heavy silence. He had the kind of presence that filled a room without a sound. He didn't yell often. He didn't need to. A single look from him was enough to freeze me where I stood. He believed in structure, in discipline, in the idea that respect was earned through obedience. Respect, he once said, polishing his old wristwatch, is not love, it's order. Without it, you have chaos. At that age, I didn't understand the difference. I thought respect was love, that the two were inseparable. I thought being good meant being loved, so I learned early how to avoid mistakes, to anticipate his moods, to read the warning signs in his posture, to stay invisible when his voice dropped low. He worked as a factory supervisor, leaving early every morning and returning just after sunset. When he came home, his shirt smelled of metal and smoke. I would hear the sound of his boots on the porch, slow and steady, and my stomach would tighten, not from fear exactly, but from habit. Even now, decades later, I can still hear that rhythm. Dinner was a ritual. We didn't talk about our days. We waited for him to speak first. My mother served quietly. My sister barely looked up from her plate. Sometimes my father would ask me a question, something simple, like how I did in school that day. But the answer always felt like a test. If I said too little, I was ungrateful. If I said too much, I was disrespectful. It was during one of those dinners that he decided to teach me the meaning of respect, though I wouldn't realize it until much later. I was 12. I had started to notice things my father didn't want me to notice. The cracks in his authority, the tension in his voice when he spoke to my mother, the way he seemed smaller when he took off his work jacket, as if the weight of the day had finally caught up to him. That night, I made a mistake. A small one, at least to me. He asked me to pass the salt. I didn't hear him the first time. My mind had drifted to a story I was writing for class about a boy who wanted to be free from rules. My father's voice came again, sharper this time. I reached for the salt, but my elbow brushed against the glass of milk beside my plate. It tipped. The white liquid spilled across the table, soaking the tablecloth, dripping down onto the floor. For a moment, no one breathed. My sister froze. My mother reached for a napkin but stopped midway when my father's hand lifted. He didn't shout. He didn't even move. He just stared at the spreading pool of milk like it was something sacred being destroyed. Then his eyes met mine, cold, still, deliberate. He said, "Stand up." I stood, my knees trembling. "Do you think respect is about speaking politely?" His tone was calm, terrifyingly calm. "It's about being aware, present, responsible." I wanted to say I was sorry, that it was an accident, but the words stuck in my throat. He didn't like excuses. He rose from his chair slowly, every movement precise. I could hear the faint sound of the wooden chair scraping the floor. He walked around the table, each step measured, as if pacing the rhythm of his disappointment. When he stopped in front of me, I could feel his breath, steady and warm, carrying the scent of tobacco and aftershave. He said, "You've grown comfortable. Comfort makes a boy weak." He reached down and grabbed the cloth from the table. He wrung it tightly in his hands, droplets of milk running between his fingers. Then, without another word, he handed it to me. He said, "Clean it." I did. My hand shook as I wiped the table, the floor, my chair. The more I cleaned, the dirtier everything seemed to feel. My heart pounded in my ears. He stood over me the entire time, silent, unblinking, as if watching a soldier fail a duty. When I finished, he said quietly, "You'll clean it again tomorrow, and the next day, until you understand that respect means being aware of what your actions cost." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I could still hear the sound of the milk dripping, slow, rhythmic, like a clock ticking in the dark. My mother came into my room later, her steps careful on the old wooden floor. She sat on the edge of my bed but didn't say anything. After a while, she whispered, "He's not angry, he just believes this is how he teaches." I wanted to ask her if it worked, if she ever learned to stop being afraid. But I stayed quiet, because in our house, silence was the safest answer. That night, I realized something I couldn't yet put into words, that respect, in my father's world, wasn't something given. It was something taken, shaped by fear, and polished by obedience. And though I didn't know it then, that small spill of milk would become the beginning of a much larger lesson, one that would change the way I saw him forever.
The next morning, the house felt colder, not in temperature, but in spirit. My father had already left for work, and the echo of his presence still lingered in the air, like the faint smell of smoke after a fire. My mother avoided my eyes as she packed his lunch tin. My sister slipped quietly out the door for school, pretending she didn't see me. I sat at the breakfast table, staring at the stain that still marked the wood, faint but visible, a pale ghost of last night's mistake. The milk had dried into a white outline, and though I had scrubbed it clean, I could still feel it there. That mark, I thought, was what my father wanted me to see every day. A quiet reminder that respect was not forgiven, it was earned, again and again. Before leaving, my mother spoke softly. "Wipe the table again before he comes home," she said, her tone gentle but weighted. "He notices everything." He always did. I went to school that day, but my mind stayed home, looping through the sound of his voice, the way he said "present responsible" like it was a sacred rule I had broken. Every tick of the classroom clock felt like another step toward evening, toward the hour his footsteps would return. When I came home, the air was still. I cleaned the table again, just as he said. I took my time, polishing every inch, tracing over the invisible outline of the spill until my hands were raw. When I finished, I stood back and looked at my reflection in the polished surface, a boy trying to understand what being a man meant in his father's house. That evening, he came home at his usual hour, 6:47 p.m., sharp. I heard the gate creak, the sound of his boots on the gravel, and my heart began to pound the way it always did. There was a ritual to it all. My mother would turn down the radio, my sister would straighten her skirt, and I would sit upright, waiting for the door to open. He entered with his usual slow precision, setting his metal lunch tin on the counter, washing his hands in silence. His eyes moved around the room like a quiet inspector, taking in the details. Then, without a word, he walked to the table. He ran his hand over the wood. The faint trace of a smile, or something close to it, appeared. "Good," he said finally. "You remembered." I nodded. He sat down, motioning for me to join him. "Do you know why I made you do that?" I shook my head. "Because when a man makes a mistake, he doesn't wait to be forgiven. He fixes it, again and again, until it's right." He leaned back in his chair now, his voice lower. "Respect is not about fear. It's about consistency, about never letting your carelessness shame the people who depend on you." I wanted to believe him. I really did. but something in his tone, the way respect always seemed to mean obedience, didn't sit right inside me. Still, I said nothing. That became our pattern. Every day after school, I wiped the table. Every day he checked it with the same hand, the same expression, and every day I told myself I was learning something important. But the truth was, I wasn't learning respect. I was learning silence. Weeks passed. The small ritual grew into something heavier. He began finding new ways to test me, small, quiet trials wrapped in his logic of discipline. One night he asked me to set the table for dinner. I made sure every plate, fork, and glass was perfectly placed, yet when he sat down, he noticed that one spoon was slightly tilted to the left. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at me with that same unreadable calm. A man who can't see small things will never be trusted with big ones. He made me reset the table 4 times, each time slower, more deliberate. When I finished, my hands were trembling. I thought that would be the end of it, but he wasn't done. He said, "Now sit and tell me what you learned." I swallowed, to pay attention? He nodded, but his eyes didn't soften. No, to respect the order of things. The world punishes carelessness, boy. I'm just teaching you early. That night as I lay in bed, I wondered what kind of world punished a boy for a spoon's direction. Over the months, those small lessons began to change me. I became cautious, careful with every word, every movement. I learned how to predict his mood from the way he closed the door or adjusted his belt. I knew when to stay invisible, when to offer help, when to disappear entirely. It wasn't until years later that I would understand what was happening, that my father wasn't just teaching me respect, he was teaching me control, the kind he himself had been taught as a boy. He never told me much about his own childhood, but once, just once, after a long night when he'd had too much to drink, he spoke quietly from his chair. "My father used to line us up every Sunday," he said, staring into nothing. "He'd make us recite rules before breakfast. If we forgot one, he'd make us kneel on the wooden floor until our knees bled. But we never disrespected him, not once." Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "That's how a man learns his place in the world." The next morning, he acted as if the conversation never happened, but I never forgot it. I began to see him differently after that, not just as a man who demanded order, but as someone who had been built by it, shaped and scarred by the same kind of discipline he now passed down like an heirloom. One afternoon after school, I saw him standing in the yard staring at the fence he'd painted months earlier. He was holding a brush, but he wasn't painting, just standing there, eyes far away. For the first time, he looked old to me, tired, almost fragile. I stepped closer. "Do you want me to help?" He turned, startled as if I had interrupted a private memory. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes, just don't rush it." We painted in silence. The air smelled of rain and turpentine. Our strokes moved in a rhythm, his strong and steady, mine uncertain. After a while, he said, "Respect isn't about fear. It's about doing what must be done even when no one's watching." I looked at him, wanting to ask, "And what if someone is always watching?" But I stayed silent, because even in that moment of closeness, the line between us still stood. That night I heard him humming softly in the living room, an old tune I didn't recognize. For the first time in years, I thought maybe he was happy. But even then, I knew that happiness, like silence, was something temporary in his world, because for my father, peace was not found in freedom, it was found in order. And I was still trying to understand which of those two things I was supposed to live for.
There comes a time when silence starts to scream. For me, that moment arrived on a gray Sunday in 1993, the kind of afternoon where the whole neighborhood seemed asleep, curtains drawn, televisions humming softly behind closed doors. My father had decided that we would fix the front gate that day, It had been squeaking for weeks, and every morning he mentioned it like a personal insult. "People hear that sound," he said, "and they think this family doesn't care about order." I didn't understand how a squeaky gate could shame a man, but by then I had learned better to argue. He handed me a small metal can of oil and a rag. "Start here," he said. "Clean the hinges first, properly." His tone was even, too even. That kind of calm always scared me more than shouting. It meant he was watching closely, waiting for me to prove something. The sun was low, gold light spilling across the lawn. I wiped at the old rust and tried to focus on my task. The hinges were stiff, worn by years of weather, but I worked at them until the rag came away red-brown with dust. When I thought I was done, I stepped back. "I think it's fine now," I said. He reached forward, pushed the gate, and it let out a soft creak, just enough to betray me. His eyes narrowed. "Fine," he said. "You call that fine?" My throat tightened. I'll fix it." He didn't answer. He just stood there, the weight of his silence pressing on me harder than any words. I rubbed harder, poured more oil, wiped again until the hinges gleamed. The metal squealed once, then quieted. I looked at him, waiting for approval. He nodded, barely. "Better, but remember, a job isn't done until it's done right." Something inside me flickered. It wasn't anger, not yet. More like exhaustion that had learned to disguise itself as obedience. I was tired of being tested, tired of mistakes that weren't really mistakes. That night at dinner, it happened again. My sister dropped her spoon, just a small clatter against the floor, but his eyes went straight to me. "Pick it up," he said. I froze for a second, not sure why I had to do it, but I bent down, picked up the spoon, and wiped it on a napkin. He took a slow sip of his tea. "You see," he said, "real respect is when a man takes responsibility for order, even when others cause the mess." My hands tightened around the napkin. I could feel something building behind my ribs, pressing upward like a storm. And then he added, "That's the difference between a man and a boy." It was small, almost casual, but something broke inside me. The words lodged deep. A man and a boy. I looked up at him, my voice shaking. Maybe respect isn't about always cleaning someone else's mess. The room went still. My mother looked down at her plate, and my sister's eyes widened. My father's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. Too calm. "What did you say?" I swallowed hard. "I just mean respect should go both ways." He stared at me for what felt like hours. The clock ticked behind him, loud in the silence. "Stand up," he said finally. My legs felt weak as I pushed my chair back. He stood too, slow, deliberate, like a judge about to pass sentence. "You think I don't respect you?" I didn't know how to answer. His tone wasn't angry. It was worse. Disappointed. "I give you a roof, food, clothes. I teach you discipline so the world doesn't crush you. That is respect. But you," his voice dropped, "you want freedom. You think you're ready for that?" He stepped closer, and for a second I thought he might strike me. But instead he just said, quietly, "You'll learn what respect costs." Then he turned and left the room. I stood there, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would crack my ribs. My mother reached for my arm, whispering, "Don't talk back to him, please." But something inside me had already changed. The fear that used to silence me had burned into something sharper. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, the house quiet, except for the distant hum of the ceiling fan. Every sound was too loud, every shadow too familiar. I thought about all the times I'd done everything right and still felt wrong, all the moments when his silence had taught me to doubt my own voice. And for the first time, I thought, maybe I don't need his version of respect anymore. The next morning, he asked me to polish his shoes before work. It was something I'd done since I was 10. Usually, I'd take them, sit by the door, and shine them until they looked new. But that day, I looked at him. Really looked at him. The creases around his eyes, the slight sag in his shoulders.
He looked smaller somehow, more human. "Dad," I said quietly, "you can do it yourself today." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't shouted or angry. It was just honest. For a moment, he didn't move. The words hung between us like a fragile bridge, and I waited for it to collapse. But instead of shouting, he just stared. A long, unreadable stare. Then he picked up the shoes himself and walked away. He didn't speak to me for 3 days. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't the same as before. This time I felt something different beneath it. Not fear, but space. Space I had carved for myself. When he finally spoke again, it was at dinner. He said quietly, "A man should know when to speak and when to act." I nodded, unsure if he meant it as a warning or an acknowledgement. But inside I knew. Something in our house had shifted. He might never say it out loud, but that was the first time I stood on equal ground with him. That night, lying in bed, I thought about everything he'd taught me, not just through his rules, but through the spaces between them. I began to see that his version of respect was built on fear, and mine would have to be built on courage. Still, the sound of that gate, that creak of metal and rust, stayed in my mind. Every time it moved, it sounded like a ghost of his voice saying, "Do it right." And I wondered if he'd ever realized that sometimes doing it right wasn't the same as doing it his way.
I didn't realize how much of my father lived inside me until years later, long after I'd moved out, long after the smell of shoe polish and rusted hinges had faded from my hands. By then, I was 29, working in a small town outside of Chicago. I had my own apartment, a quiet place with wooden floors and a window that faced the street. Every morning, when I left for work, I would hear the faint creak of the door hinge, and every time it would take me back to that gate, to the smell of oil and dust, to the sound of my father's breath behind me. At first, I hated how memory followed me everywhere. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something heavier, like a presence I hadn't invited but couldn't escape. But as time went on, that weight began to change shape. I remember one evening vividly. It was raining. Slow, steady, rhythmic. The kind of rain that makes the world quiet. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee, and for some reason, I thought of him. My father, the man who measured love in lessons and silence. It had been almost 6 years since I'd last seen him. We'd spoken on the phone a few times, short, polite calls that felt more like duty than connection. "How's work?" he would ask. "Fine," I'd say. "Good," he'd reply. And that was it. I'd tell myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need his approval anymore. But every time I hung up, there was a hollow sound inside me, the echo of a gate that still creaked no matter how much oil I poured on it. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I picked up the phone and called home. My mother answered. Her voice was softer than I remembered. Tired, but kind. "He's in the garden," she said. "You want me to get him?" I hesitated. "No, it's okay. Just tell him I called." But she didn't hang up. She sighed. "He misses you, you know?" I didn't answer. She added, "He just doesn't know how to say it." Something about that line hit me like a quiet truth I'd been avoiding for years. He doesn't know how to say it. It was so simple and so painfully human. A week later, I drove back home. The road was long, lined with old trees that looked older than my memories. When I reached the house, it looked smaller, almost fragile. The paint was peeling. The gate, that same gate, still stood there. But this time, when I pushed it, it didn't creak. Someone had fixed it. He was in the garden, just like my mother said, bent over a row of dying plants, his hands deep in the soil. His hair was gray now, thinner than I remembered. When he saw me, he didn't smile.
But he didn't frown either. He just nodded, like we were continuing a conversation that had paused years ago. "You came," he said. "I did." There was silence, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was cautious, like we were both learning to breathe again. We sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun fade behind the old trees. The house smelled the same: wood, tea, and memory. He poured me a cup and asked, "You still polish your shoes?" I smiled faintly. "Sometimes, when I have to meet someone important." He nodded. "Good habit."
I wanted to tell him how many times I'd hated that ritual, how many mornings I'd sworn I'd never be like him. But I couldn't. Because as I watched him, older and smaller under the weight of years, I realized I had become him in ways I didn't expect. Not the harshness, but the discipline, the structure, the quiet. For a while, we didn't talk. Then he said something I never thought I'd hear. "You were right that day." I turned to him, unsure I'd heard correctly. "About respect," he said. "It should go both ways." I didn't know what to say. The man who had taught me to fear mistakes was now admitting his own. He kept looking ahead, his voice low. "When I was your age, my father was harder than I ever was. He believed fear made men strong. I just didn't know another way." And suddenly I saw him, not as the towering figure from my childhood, but as a man who had been trying, failing, and repeating what he'd been taught. He wasn't just a father, he was someone's frightened son once too. We didn't hug, we didn't cry. That wasn't his way. But when I left that night, as I opened the gate, he called after me. "Take care of yourself." I turned, and for the first time, he was smiling. Small, hesitant, but real. Driving home that night, I thought about all the years between us, the silence, the fear, the unspoken lessons. And I realized something he had been teaching me, even in his mistakes. He had shown me what control could do to love, what silence could do to trust. And because of that, I had learned the value of gentleness, the kind that doesn't come from power, but from understanding. Now, whenever I hear the sound of hinges creaking, I don't flinch. I listen. It reminds me that even the strongest metal softens with care, that even the hardest lessons can turn into quiet forgiveness. Years later, when I had a son of my own, I caught myself saying things my father once said about order, respect, effort. But I also did something he never could. I added, "And it's okay to make mistakes." Sometimes, late at night when the house is still, I hear the echo of his footsteps, steady, familiar, fading into memory. Not as a warning anymore, but as a rhythm. The sound of a man who tried his best in a language he never learned how to soften. And I whisper into the dark, almost like a prayer. "I understand now, Dad." Because love, I've learned, doesn't always sound like love when it's spoken through fear. But somewhere, buried under all that silence, it still waits, hoping to be heard.